Hey everybody, it's Anna and welcome back to my booktube channel. Today I wanted to share with you some of my recent reads from the second half of September. I have 5 books that I'm going to share with you here. And kind of true to form, if you watched my wrap up from the first half of September, this one was a real mixed bag. So I've got 2 nonfiction books and 3 novels. Let's go ahead and get into them. So my first nonfiction book was one that I absolutely loved. I read it for my nonfiction book club, and this is The Shortest History of the Dinosaurs, the 230 million year story of their time on Earth by Riley Black. So I had never read anything by this author before, but she's a paleontologist and she's written a bunch of different books about dinosaurs. This is basically like picking up where my dinosaur-obsessed childhood left off, but now with even more science to tell me about how many different amazing and cool discoveries we have made about dinosaurs since then. Riley Black says that we are actually in a sort of new renaissance of dinosaur studies and paleontology, partially because we are finding so many new fossils that we didn't have access to previously, but also because of paradigm shifts in the way that we think about and study dinosaur species, things like how they shaped and altered the world around them, and things of that nature. One of the coolest things that I learned reading this book was that dinosaurs were actually pretty colorful, kind of comparable to the way that birds are now. I knew that we had feathered dinosaurs, and I knew that we had creatures that weren't dinosaurs, but that lived during the time of the dinosaurs that could fly. But we've learned so many cool things about how they are very colorful. We have learned a lot about things like how Triceratops' horns were more for them kind of jousting and sparring with each other or showing off to attract potential mates than what we thought when I was a kid, which is that they were primarily for self-defense. This was such a fascinating book. It wasn't just a history of like the dinosaurs and the different kind of iconic species that we all know and love, but also the history of our planet and kind of a peek into the past of a world that really just doesn't exist anymore. I thought that this book was fantastic. I think if you're at all interested in the dinosaurs, this is a really good and a pretty quick read. There's also a pretty good extensive bibliography in the back, as well as the other books that the author has written. I'm definitely going to be reading some more of these, but this is kind of a get yourself up to speed on the state of paleontology today. And I think this is definitely going to be one of my favorite books from this year. So now we're kind of going back to a book that I talked about when I did my Disability Pride Month video, where I was recommending books for adults for Disability Pride Month. And I read American Breakdown by Jennifer London. This was subtitled Our Ailing Nation, My Body's Revolt, and the 19th Century Woman Who Brought Me Back to Life. This is kind of a tough book to categorize and describe. It's partially a memoir of the author's own experience with chronic illness. She's eventually diagnosed with ME/CFS and multiple chemical sensitivities. It's also part history book about Alice James, who was the sibling of the famed American writers Henry James and William James, who also became bedbound throughout her adult life off and on for something similar that might be called ME nowadays, but it was neurasthenia back then, or hysteria, because of course it was a completely made up and psychosomatic illness because of her nervous temperament. And then it's also kind of a history of the like medical model of these diseases and the ways in which we have kind of traced similar conditions throughout our history, and the ways in which laws and policy in the United States in particular surrounding pollution and what is determined like acceptable levels of exposure to certain types of chemicals have shaped the way that we think about these diseases. So if that sounds like a lot, it's because it kind of is. I think while I enjoyed my time with this book, it really struggled with the sort of ballooning scope about a third of the way through the book. And I think it had the unfortunate result of kind of undermining the efficacy of the author's narrative or of the argument for her book, simply because we spend so many chapters in the middle of the book kind of going through exposition about how the EPA changed regulations for clean indoor air, or how such and such a doctor at this particular time in the 19th century came up with this new way of thinking about like diseases that were caused by women's issues. And it's not that those things were irrelevant to the story per se, but I think the way that it was structured and the amount of detail that some of those chapters went into didn't really do the author's narrative too much of a service. So I'm glad I read it, but I also acknowledge that this is not like the greatest of these sort of disability justice or like history, medical history type books I have ever read. So it was fine. I think if you're interested in the topic, you'll probably like it. And I am ultimately very glad I read it. It's just that there are books that deal with similar topics that I thought were better at it. So there you go. Moving right along to our novels, we're going to start with some of the books that I got from the Baltimore Book Festival, and unfortunately one of those is going to be a disappointment, and that is The Magician of Tiger Castle by Louis Sachar. So he is the author of Holes and Sideways Stories from Wayside School series, both of which were childhood favorites in my household, and this is his first novel for adults. I'm sorry to say I did not get along with this book at all. It really left me feeling kind of cold and disappointed. But what is this story about? So in this book, which is sort of fantasy, but mostly really historical fiction, we follow this magician whose name is Anatole, and he is kind of like an alchemist. He's existing on the precipice between magic and science, and it takes place in a fictionalized country during the Renaissance, like that beginning of the modern world kind of thing. And he has to use his sort of potion-making abilities to get out of a situation where he is trapped between his desire to help the princess of his kingdom escape an arranged marriage to a downright villain, and also the threats that he's receiving from the rest of the royal family to just make a potion that will make the princess compliant because they really need this marriage for the political alliance already. So that's kind of the setup for this book. Unfortunately, there's just really not that much here to grab onto. I am more than okay with reading books where not very much happens, particularly if they're full of like well-drawn characters or very introspective sessions, or there's a lot of like discussion of the philosophy or the ideas, you know, like the ideas novel is something that I'm in favor of reading. But because this novel is so plot-driven, and the plot is honestly kind of anemic, not very much happens, there isn't much tension or stakes, there's not much there to keep me reading for the plot, and there's hardly any character development either. So I was just kind of left wondering, why was this book written and who was it really written for? Another thing that I think was kind of an issue with this book is that it really read a lot more like a middle grade or a YA book, even though it says that it's written for adults. There's a couple passing references to sex and sexuality that honestly I would not have found particularly objectionable had they been in a young adult or maybe even upper middle grade novel that doesn't really go into great detail. So it wasn't an adult book by virtue of like content. And it really lacked a lot of the charm of his books for younger readers. So that's kind of what I mean when I say I wonder who this book was for, or like, why was this story written? Why this story now, and for whom? So unfortunately, this was a big disappointment for me. I feel kind of underwhelmed by my experience and my time with it. I felt pretty much the opposite, though, about the second book that I purchased when I was at the Baltimore Book Festival earlier in September, and that was Lessons in Magic and Disaster by Charlie Jane Anders. So this is a sort of speculative, kind of fantastical story about this woman named Jamie who is a witch. She is queer and transgender, and she is also a PhD student at a fictional college or university, I guess, kind of in the Boston area. And Jamie can do magic. Magic for her is basically just focusing and honing her heart's desire and her intentions to try and make her wishes and her desires come true. And she winds up using her knowledge of magic to try and reconnect with her mom, who's become distant in her grief over Jamie's second mom, who died years ago, in a pretty upsetting way. So if you're sensitive to parental death or cancer, that is kind of a big part of this book, so just be aware of that going in. Kind of along the way, this tension between Jamie and her mom also causes a rift between Jamie and her partner, Ro. They have been married for years at this point. Ro is also a PhD student. They are also trans. And the two of them have just this great emotional connection, but also like intellectual sparring connection that was a total delight to read. Ro feels Jamie becoming increasingly more distant and that Jamie is keeping secrets from them because Jamie has never told Ro about her ability to do magic, despite the fact that they have been married for years. So, some bad things happen because of that. And I really, really loved my time with this book. This book also had like strong elements of the literary mystery that I loved so much about, like the novel Possession by A.S. Byatt. This book also inspired me. I'm working on like a wider video about like dark academia and what that actually means when we talk about it as a literary genre, or if it even gets to count as a literary genre at all. So this book made me think about those things, and it also gave me a lot of things to add to my reading list from the like 18th century literature written by women. The literary mystery of Jamie's PhD work centers around a fictional novel that was written by, what was her name? Fielding. Henry Fielding's sister, whose name was Sarah. There we go. So I do want to read a lot more of those books. I would say my main criticism of this book is that it didn't quite stick the landing. There is a conflict with Jamie and Ro that is present throughout most of the course of this book, and there's a sort of element of their character and their relationship that comes up as kind of a throwaway line pretty early on that then becomes a much more important part of how the conflict in their relationship is resolved. But because it was such a throwaway line at the beginning, it did seem like it kind of came out of nowhere, and I just didn't feel that that was in keeping with most of the character work that had gone into developing them and into developing their relationships with each other. So I thought that was a bit awkward, but other than that, this was a really excellent book. I would recommend it for sure. And then, last but not least, we have kind of a nostalgic read, and that is The Celery Stalks at Midnight by James Howe, who is the author of the Bunnicula series. Did not know that this was a series until I hit adulthood, and I reread the first book, Bunnicula, last year, and this is a follow-up where Chester and Harold, the cat and dog in the household where Bunnicula lives, are joined by their new friend, Howie, who's a tiny little dachshund puppy. And Chester's paranoia about Bunnicula's vegetable vampirism kind of reaches new heights because he becomes convinced, and he tries to get all the other animals on board with the fact that he thinks that Bunnicula is biting into vegetables and draining them out of their juices in order to turn them into his vampire thralls. So he's basically worried that there's going to be a bunch of mindless zombie celery stalks terrorizing the neighborhood and doing whatever Bunnicula's evil whims are. These books are just so dang good. I really think that they are gems of children's literature in the sense that they can be enjoyed by people of all ages. They're genuinely so funny. I think there's a lot of jokes in here that might even go over a kid's head. Probably, definitely a kid now, but I'm like reading this and, you know, these books are not that much older than I am, and I'm laughing at jokes that I definitely would not have comprehended as a kid. But I do really remember enjoying my time with Bunnicula as a kid, and I'm glad that I decided to keep reading this series. I have 2 more books in this that I may add to like a additional padding out of my spooky season TBR, because I am actually getting kind of close to wrapping that up, so I will probably be releasing a part 2. but that's definitely going to include more of the Bunniculus stories. And that's it. That's what I read in the second half of September. By the time you see this, my Shaketember wrap-up will have already gone live on the channel. And I did want to add something here because this was kind of a last-minute Shaketember ad that I didn't plan into my TBR. But we spent some time watching the movie Grand Theft Hamlet at the very end of the month. And if you have not heard of this before, it is a documentary film about two British actors who, when they are stuck in lockdown in the UK during the pandemic, they start playing Grand Theft Auto Online, the video game. And they get it into their minds that they kind of want to see if they could put on a production of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, that takes place entirely in Grand Theft Auto Online. And there's a lot of hijinks that ensue as they try to figure out the logistics of getting video game avatars with very awkward and stilted physical animations to do emotes and acting. They try to host auditions without having other players of the game come in and just start shooting, because that player versus player is a big part of playing this game online. And it's also about kind of their personal lives as well, living through the pandemic, what it means to be an artist in a world where art is not considered particularly valuable because it tends to not be a lucrative career choice, as well as kind of the importance of your offline relationships and your relationships outside of the making of your art. And I really, really loved this movie. I thought it was hilarious. There were multiple laugh out loud moments from both of us as we were watching this, and I would wholeheartedly recommend this to anybody who is interested. I don't know where it's available to watch country by country. For us, we watched it on Mubi, which is a movie streaming website that we, I think, got like a 7-day free trial to be able to watch the movie for. So definitely worth your time, and I'm gonna leave in the description an article that I read after the fact about like what went into the making of this movie and what it meant to the creators, you know, years on down the line after being out of that lockdown stage of the pandemic and seeing what it was like when this movie was released and went out into the world. So that is all that I have for you today. I hope that your September reading has gone well. Let me know if you have read any of the books I mentioned today, or if you've seen Grand Theft Hamlet. I would also love to know about that. Or just let me know what you've been reading, watching, listening to, enjoying during this fall time. So as always, thank you all so very much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye.